Deconstructing Jed McKenna's conversations with Julie. The conversations between Jed McKenna and his student, Julie, as documented in his seminal works, offer a raw, unflinching, and often unsettling exploration of reality, self, and the arduous path to spiritual awakening. Far from offering comforting platitudes or gradual practices, their dialogues are a surgical dissection of illusion, a relentless application of the spiritual guillotine, aimed at severing the ties that bind us to the dream state we mistake for reality. This video delves into the core themes and methodologies that emerge from these intense exchanges, highlighting the radical nature of McKenna's teachings as filtered through his interaction with Julie. The brutal honesty and the rejection of comfort. One of the most striking aspects of McKenna's dialogue with Julie is the stark and often brutal honesty. He dismantles cherished spiritual concepts, exposes the ego's insidious strategies for self-preservation, and refuses to sugarcoat the difficulty of genuine self-inquiry. There is no room for spiritual bypassing or clinging to comforting illusions. McKenna, through his direct and sometimes abrasive style, forces Julie, and by extension the reader, to confront the uncomfortable truths about the nature of the self and the world. McKenna relentlessly attacks common spiritual cliches and feel-good pronouncements. Concepts like unconditional love are scrutinized for their often superficial understanding, and the pursuit of blissful states is exposed as another egoic desire. He compels Julie to look beyond the surface and examine the underlying motivations and assumptions, exposing the ego's deception. A significant portion of their dialogue centers on identifying and dismantling the ego's intricate web of defenses and justifications. McKenna meticulously points out how the ego masquerades as the spiritual seeker, using spiritual concepts to reinforce its own sense of separate identity and control. He teaches Julie to recognize the subtle ways the ego manipulates thoughts, emotions, and experiences to maintain its dominance. The unpleasantness of truth. McKenna doesn't shy away from the inherent discomfort that arises when deeply held beliefs are challenged. He emphasizes that genuine spiritual progress often involves confronting pain, fear, and the dismantling of one's carefully constructed self-image. This stark realism distinguishes his approach from more palatable spiritual narratives. The primacy of self-inquiry and the spiritual guillotine. At the heart of McKenna's teachings, as conveyed through his interactions with Julie, lies the relentless practice of self-inquiry. This isn't a passive contemplation, but an active, razor-sharp questioning of every belief, assumption, and identification. The spiritual guillotine is the metaphor for this incisive process, ruthlessly severing the head of the illusory self. The unflinching, who am I? McKenna guides Julie through a rigorous and persistent examination of the question, who am I? This isn't about finding intellectual answers, but about directly experiencing the absence of a fixed, independent self when deeply investigated. He pushes Julie to go beyond superficial responses and delve into the core of her being. Deconstructing belief systems. Their dialogues involve the systematic dismantling of belief systems, both spiritual and mundane. McKenna encourages Julie to question the validity of every thought and assumption, to trace its origin and expose its often arbitrary nature. This process reveals how much of our perceived reality is based on unexamined beliefs. The importance of direct experience. McKenna consistently emphasizes the primacy of direct experience over intellectual understanding or the acceptance of authority. He pushes Julie to move beyond reading and theorizing and to engage in the direct investigation of her own consciousness. The role of doubt. Unlike many spiritual traditions that encourage faith, McKenna embraces doubt as a crucial tool in self-inquiry. He encourages Julie to doubt everything, including his own teachings, as a means of arriving at her own authentic understanding. 3. The nature of reality and the illusion of separation. Through their conversations, McKenna unveils a radical understanding of reality as a singular, undifferentiated consciousness. The illusion of separate selves and a distinct external world arises within this consciousness, akin to characters and settings in a dream. Consciousness as the ground of being. McKenna posits that consciousness is the fundamental reality, the canvas upon which all experience unfolds. The individual self, the physical world, and all phenomena are ultimately manifestations within this unified field of awareness. The dream analogy revisited. The dream analogy is a recurring motif in their dialogues, used to illustrate the illusory nature of our waking experience. Just as dream characters have no independent existence outside the dreamer's mind, so too our individual selves are seen as temporary constructs within the larger consciousness. The illusion of the observer and the observed. McKenna challenges the fundamental duality of the observer and the observed. He guides Julie to recognize that the I that perceives the world is itself a construct within consciousness, and that ultimately there is no separate perceiver or perceived. The nature of suffering. Suffering is presented as a direct consequence of clinging to the illusion of separation. By identifying with a limited, vulnerable self, we become susceptible to fear, anxiety, and attachment. The realization of our true nature as unified consciousness dissolves the basis for suffering. Wavering commitment to truth, even when it is painful. The catalyst for awakening. McKenna acts as a catalyst, providing the necessary pressure and perspective to accelerate Julie's self-inquiry. He mirrors back her own illusions and challenges her to confront them directly. The ultimate responsibility of the seeker. Despite his active role, McKenna emphasizes that the ultimate responsibility for awakening lies with the individual seeker. He can provide guidance and tools, but the actual work of self-inquiry and the shattering of illusions must be undertaken by the student. 5. The nature of awakening and the end of seeking. The ultimate goal of McKenna's teachings, as explored through his conversations with Julie, is the realization of one's true nature as the undifferentiated consciousness. This awakening marks the end of the search for external validation and the cessation of suffering rooted in the illusion of separation. The recognition of no self. Awakening involves the direct and experiential understanding that there is no fixed, independent self. The I thought is seen as a temporary construct, like a wave arising and dissolving in the ocean of consciousness. The end of the dream. The realization of the illusory nature of reality brings an end to the dream state of separation and suffering. The awakened individual recognizes the play of consciousness without identifying with any particular role or form. Effortless being. With the dissolution of the ego and the recognition of one's true nature, there is a shift from striving and seeking to a state of effortless being. Actions arise spontaneously from the unified consciousness without the interference of egoic desires and fears. Beyond understanding. McKenna emphasizes that true awakening is not merely an intellectual understanding, but a fundamental shift in perception and being. It is a direct realization that transcends conceptual frameworks. Conclusion. The dialogues between Jed McKenna and Julie offer a radical and uncompromising path to spiritual awakening. Through brutal honesty, relentless self-inquiry, and the incisive application of the spiritual guillotine, they dissect the illusions that bind us to the dream of separation. McKenna's teachings, as experienced through Julie's journey, challenge conventional spiritual wisdom and demand a level of unwavering commitment and intellectual rigor. Their conversations serve as a potent and often unsettling reminder that the path to truth requires a willingness to confront discomfort, dismantle cherished beliefs, and ultimately, to sever the head of the illusory self in the relentless pursuit of what truly is. The razor's edge of their dialogue cuts through the superficial layers of spiritual seeking, exposing the raw and often challenging truth of our being.
Ever feel like you're just wading through tons of spiritual advice, trying to figure out what actually works, what cuts through the noise?
Yeah, there's so much out there.
Because if you do, that's exactly what we're going to tackle today. We are diving deep into the, well, pretty intense conversations between Jed McKenna and his student Julie, the stuff in his books.
Right.
Think of this as like your shortcut to understanding a really, really radical perspective on, well, everything.
And what's really striking straight away is how these dialogues, they're described as raw, unflinching, even unsettling. It's an exploration of reality, the self-awakening.
Definitely not your average feel-good spiritual chat.
Not at all. It contrasts sharply with more conventional stuff. Our aim here is really to pull out the key nuggets, the most important bits from these intense exchanges.
Absolutely. Forget the comforting platitudes,
Yeah.
We're stepping into McKenna's world. He talks about this thing called the spiritual guillotine.
Which sounds pretty dramatic.
It does. And it kind of is. It means basically relentlessly cutting through all the comfortable illusions we have about ourselves, slice by slice.
Yeah.
So, our mission for this deep dive, get to the bottom of the core themes, the methods that pop up in these talks between McKenna and Julie, and figure out what makes his approach so different. Okay, where do we start? I think that brutal honesty is key.
That really jumps out. The source material calls it stark and often brutal honesty.
Yeah.
It's not just question ideas. He seems to actively dismantle concepts people really cherish in spirituality.
Right.
And there's just this refusal to sugarcoat how incredibly difficult real self-inquiry actually is.
No kidding. No easy paths here.
Yeah.
He goes straight for those concepts we often lean on, doesn't he? Like unconditional love. He doesn't just accept it.
No.
He pushes Julie, and through her, pushes you, the listener, to really ask, okay, what's really driving that? Is it genuinely unconditional, or is there some, ego need hiding in there?
And the same goes for chasing blissful states, right? He questions the motivation behind that constant seeking.
Which leads right into the ego, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's a huge focus. Unmasking how the ego keeps itself in charge.
Exactly. McKenna basically argues the ego is this master manipulator. It can even put on spiritual clothes, use spiritual concepts just to maintain that sense of being a separate me. It's all about control.
Like putting on a disguise.
Yeah.
A holy disguise sometimes.
Pretty much. He teaches Julie how to spot this, how the ego twists thoughts, feelings, even profound experiences just to stay dominant.
And crucially, our source points out that McKenna just doesn't flinch from the unpleasantness, the discomfort that bubbles up when your core beliefs get poked.
Which is kind of the whole point, isn't it? Facing that pain, letting that carefully built self-image crumble. He presents that as essential for any real progress.
Yeah, it's a huge differentiator. So many paths offer comfort, reassurance. McKenna seems to offer a really sharp knife.
A tool for cutting through, yeah.
Yeah.
Not for comfort.
Okay, so we've got this stark honesty, this confronting approach. Now, let's dig into his core method. The source calls it the relentless practice of self-inquiry. This is where that spiritual guillotine metaphor really comes alive.
And it's important to get that this isn't like gentle reflection. It's described as active, razor-sharp questioning. Questioning every belief, every assumption, everything you identify with. That guillotine idea really fits, It's about ruthlessly chopping away at that illusion of who you think you are.
Definitely. And central to that is the big question. Who am I? But he's not looking for some clever philosophical answer, right?
Not at all. It's about the direct experience that arises when you truly investigate. The experience of maybe not finding a solid, separate self there. He hammers away at this with Julie, pushing past all the usual easy answers.
And this questioning extends to everything, doesn't it? Belief systems.
Oh, yeah. Both spiritual beliefs and just everyday assumptions about the world. Their dialogues involve systematically taking them apart. Where did this belief come from? Is it actually valid? He shows how much of what we take as real is kind of arbitrary.
It's a pretty wild way to look at things we take for granted.
It really is. And the bedrock of all this questioning is McKenna's absolute insistence on direct experience. He keeps pushing Julie, and again, you, the listener, beyond just reading or hearing ideas.
It's about investigating your own consciousness.
Yeah.
Directly. Right now.
Exactly. So it's not enough to think, oh, maybe there's no self. It has to become a direct seeing, a felt realization.
And what about doubt? Usually, spirituality emphasizes faith.
That's another fascinating contrast. McKenna sees doubt not as a hindrance, but as a crucial tool. He actively encourages doubting everything, including his own words.
Really?
Yeah. The idea is that only through radical doubt can you arrive at your own authentic understanding, something that isn't just borrowed from someone else.
Okay, so this intense self-inquiry, fueled by doubt. Where does it ultimately point? According to the source, it leads to a view of reality that's, well, pretty mind-bending. A singular, undifferentiated consciousness. Let's try to unpack that.
Right. This is the core idea, really, that consciousness isn't something we have, it's what we are. It's the fundamental reality, the ground of all being.
The screen, not just the movie playing on it.
Kind of like that, yeah. Everything we perceive, the self, the world, thoughts, feelings, it's all just appearances, manifestations within this one unified field of awareness.
And he uses that dream analogy a lot to explain this, doesn't he? The source mentions it again.
He does. Just like in a dream, the characters and the whole dream world seem real while you're in it, but they don't actually have independent existence apart from the dreamer's mind.
So he's suggesting our waking life, our sense of being a separate person. Like, it's like that, a construct within a larger consciousness.
That's the gist.
Ah.
Which brings up that fundamental split we usually feel. Me, the observer, and the world, the observed.
Right, the subject-object thing.
McKenna challenges that head on. He guides Julie to see that the I doing the observing, that sense of being a separate watcher, is also just another appearance within consciousness. Ultimately, there's no real separation.
Wow, okay. And that ties into suffering then. How does that work?
Well, the source connects suffering directly to clinging to that illusion of being separate. When you identify strongly with this limited, vulnerable me, you inevitably create fear, attachment, desire, all the stuff that causes pain.
Because you feel isolated and need to protect this fragile self.
Exactly. So if you realize your true nature is this unified consciousness, the whole basis for that kind of suffering just dissolves. The fear that comes from feeling separate and vulnerable loses its grip.
It makes sense. Conceptually, at least.
Yeah.
Now, what about the dynamic between Jed and Julie? That relationship seems pretty central. The source calls it complex and often challenging. McKenna as a spiritual drill sergeant.
Yeah, that's not your typical gentle, loving guru image, is it?
Not even close.
And that seems deliberate. McKenna actively rejects that comforting role. His style is described as direct, confrontational, sometimes even harsh. But the aim isn't comfort, it's dismantling the ego.
And Julie's role in this,
Yeah.
it sounds like she had to be incredibly committed. The source highlights her willingness to endure his tough guidance.
Absolutely crucial. It underscores the need for this unwavering commitment to truth. No matter how uncomfortable or how much it challenges everything you believe, you have to want it more than comfort.
So what is McKenna's role then? Is he the one causing the awakening?
Not exactly causing it, but acting as a catalyst. He provides intense pressure, a different viewpoint to accelerate Julie's own self-inquiry. He's like a mirror, reflecting her own illusions back at her so she can't avoid them.
Ah, okay. Forcing her to see what she might otherwise ignore.
Right. But, and this is important, even with his very active role, the source stresses that the ultimate responsibility is always with the student. With Julie, she has to do the inner work, the actual questioning and seeing through. He provides the pressure cooker, maybe, but she has to stay in it.
All right, the work is internal. Okay, so moving towards the goal line here.
Yeah.
What is the ultimate aim of all this? The source talks about realization of one's true nature as the undifferentiated consciousness, awakening, the end of seeking.
Yeah, that's the destination, so to speak. And a key aspect of that awakening is what's called the recognition of no self.
No self. That sounds empty or scary.
It can sound that way initially, but it's described more as the direct experiential, seeing that there's no fixed independent you running the show in the way we normally assume. That I thought, that sense of me, is seen as just a temporary pattern, a thought construct appearing in consciousness.
Like a wave on the ocean, not separate from the ocean itself.
That's a common analogy, yes. And realizing this illusory nature of the separate self and reality as we perceive it is described as the end of the dream state, the dream of separation and the suffering that comes with it.
So you still experience life, but without identifying with a specific character in the dream.
Something like that. You recognize the play of consciousness, the unfolding of events, without getting hooked into a limited identity within it.
And does this mean you just sit around doing nothing?
Apparently not. The source points towards a shift to effortless being. It's not passivity, but rather that actions arise spontaneously from this unified consciousness, without the constant push and pull of egoic desires, fears, and calculations. Less striving.
Okay. Less interference from me.
Precisely. And the final point the source emphasizes is that this awakening isn't just, getting a new intellectual understanding. It's not just another concept.
It's deeper than that.
Much deeper. It's described as a fundamental shift in perception and being, a direct realization that transcends mental frameworks.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've gone deep into these intense Jed McKenna-Julie dialogues. We've touched on his stark honesty, that relentless self-inquiry, the spiritual guillotine, his view of reality as one consciousness, and what awakening might actually mean in this context, the end of the illusion of self. Hopefully this gives you a quicker but still solid handle on these pretty challenging ideas.
And it leaves us, and you, with a pretty provocative thought to chew on, doesn't it? If that sense of self you feel so strongly, that me at the center of your world is potentially, as McKenna argues, an illusion.
Yeah.
What's actually left when you stop trying so hard to define it, when you stop clinging to it?
Mm-hmm. That's definitely something to sit with. A powerful question. Look, this deep dive is really just scratching the surface of McKenna's work. We really encourage you to mull over these ideas, maybe even check out his books yourself if you feel drawn to it. Consider this the start, perhaps, of your own deeper look into reality and who or what you really are.